Wonderful. And go ahead and take it away, Nicholas.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Nicholas Oakley. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm Director of Programs and Policy Council at the Center for Children and Youth Justice. And I would really like to extend a warm welcome, maybe a hot welcome, actually, given today's weather if you're in the Pacific Northwest. We are so glad that you're here with us today and really excited about this event. I'll keep my remarks brief so we can move on to the real show. For those of you who are not aware, the Center for Children and Youth Justice is a nonprofit. We are located in Seattle, Washington, but operate statewide. And we partnered with juvenile justice, child welfare, and related systems of care for the past 15 years to improve the lives of children, youth, and young adults. The Equality Program works to improve the lives of LGBTQ+ youth and young adults in these systems of care. For the past 7 years, I've overseen this program and began really as a research effort, listening to the voices of young people who've lived through these systems and what their needs are, what their experiences are, that resulted in the development of the Protocol for Safe and Affirming Care, which we've now implemented across the state of Washington. I used to say that our theory of change here was that we believe that you, the youth serving professionals, caregivers, and volunteers, want to do the right thing, want to help young people, but are often constricted by a lack of resources, training, capacity issues, and those sort of things. And that our role is to step in and provide that support, those additional resources, that additional training, the additional capacity so that you can better serve youth. But I am convinced that that's not a theory anymore. You have demonstrated your commitment to these young people and youth, and that you do care, and it's very heartening. So I really appreciate that, and especially in this year. I mean, what a year! Yeah, there's not a lot to say, I guess, or I don't know what to say, I should say. And so I just really want to appreciate you sticking with us. I think we often think, well, you know, this is an addition to our work. We need to, you know, we have our core work, and then we also have to support LGBTQ youth, and sometimes that's just too much. But you folks realize that no, this is core to our work. That supporting these young people is core to our work, and that's why you're here. And I just really appreciate that. So thank you. And we'll move on to the next slide, please. Wanted to do a land acknowledgement. I know that we're all in different places, but the Center for Children and Youth Justice, our office, would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. We encourage you to research the history of the land on which you sit today and acknowledge it accordingly. Also would like to say, we think it's important to move beyond land acknowledgements and really incorporate support for tribes and Native American young people and all the work that we do, and we strive to do that. Next slide, please. This is a quick overview for today. We'll have some introductory remarks, go into a keynote, have a plenary session, a lived experience panel, and closing. It is a short 3 hours. We're trying to pack it in, but also understand that, it's hard to be on Zoom for longer than 3 hours. Even that is sometimes a challenge, I think. Please note that this event is being recorded. We really encourage you to use the chat box for questions. Lily will be helping monitor that. Please remain muted. And if you feel comfortable doing so, please add your pronouns to your name. Next slide, please. Would like to give a special recognition to our partners. These are the sites across the state that have implemented the Protocol for Safe and Affirming Care. We worked with them for a number of years, and they've, again, stuck with us through this especially difficult year. Yeah, so thank you to our partners. Next slide, please. I'd also invite you to really think about, by the end of the day, identify additional ways you can better provide specific supports for young people who identify as LGBTQ+ and BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Of course, we don't have flat identities. We have both a sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and a race and ethnicity, and all of those identities impact our experiences and our needs. And it's important to pay attention to all those identities. And that's just to name a few. There are many, many, many more. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to introduce Dan Shee, one of our board members who's going to deliver a special welcome. As I said, Dan is a member of our board, previously served on the Equality Advisory Committee. Prior to joining CCYJ board, Dan served as president of Q Law, which advocates for this equality of LGBT plus Washingtonians, and was a board member at API Chaya, which seeks to end oppression and violence in Asian and Pacific Islander communities. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Nicholas. I am so humbled to greet you all this morning. The work you are doing to improve the lives of LGBTQ plus youth in juvenile justice, child welfare, and homeless youth services is so necessary, so important, and so consequential. I remember vividly my own experience as a youth coming out to my parents as gay. I was at my most vulnerable when I most needed support and affirmation, and I did not get it. The response was not acceptance, it was shame, and that was devastating. Now, I count myself lucky. I had a secure family and home. Being kicked out was never on the table, and my parents did eventually come around. The system-involved youth that we serve face incomparable insecurity, which makes them so much more in need of support and affirmation than I ever was. We need to give that to them. The good news is we are not alone in working to help our youth. Our state supports this work. From the Washington State Legislature to the leadership of DCYF, our state government vigorously backs these equality efforts, as well as key leaders in the federal government, one of whom you'll hear from shortly. And the community celebrates this work. And I'm not just talking about the LGBTQ plus community. The community at large now recognizes that LGBTQ plus youth deserve support and affirmation. So thank you so much for the work you're doing. Thank you for coming here to understand how to do even better for our youth. Your work is challenging and it is often overwhelming. Thank you for sticking with it and for having the strength to double down on your efforts to improve outcomes for all system-involved youth in our state. You are making a difference. You truly are. A generation of youth will be better because of you. Please carry that with you as you take what you discover today into your work. Next up is a special treat, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, who has represented Washington's 7th Congressional District since 2017.
I have to bring up the video. One moment, please.
I'm Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, and I'm proud to represent Washington's 7th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. Thank you to the Center for Children and Youth Justice for inviting me to share a few words with you today, and thank you for the critical work that you're doing to improve the lives of LGBTQ+ youth. As the proud parent of a trans child, I know how important it is for our kids to be able to live freely as themselves, free from discrimination. A key piece of that work is ensuring that they can be respected for who they are, especially when they're experiencing homelessness, navigating the social safety net and the justice system, or working through hardship. You all do the incredible, life-saving work of stepping in at those moments of hopelessness. You reach out to those in need and welcome them in, and you provide young people with the help and affirmations needed to survive, to recover, to thrive, and to prosper later in life. As a lifelong organizer, I'm in awe of the work that you are doing on the ground. And I want to let you know that I am fighting right alongside you inside the halls of Congress, fighting to pass legislation like the Equality Act that will truly make our LGBTQ+ friends and family equal under the law. And I'll never stop fighting until we do that. Thank you so much for all the work that you do, and let's keep it going.
Great. Much love to Congresswoman Jayapal for being willing to give us that. I'm going to bring the PowerPoint back up. One moment, please. Great. Let's go ahead and introduce our keynote.
Right, wonderful. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce this year's keynote speaker and presentation, Where We Belong, by Jawara Mcduffie. Jawara is a Black, gay, cisgender man from the South. Formerly incarcerated himself, he has spent nearly 20 years working primarily with youth to keep them out of jails and prisons. From his roles as a youth development counselor at Seattle Youth Employment Program to criminal justice strategic advisor with the Office for Civil Rights, he has put in the work. Jawara earned his BA in psychology from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and Master of Social Work from the University of Washington. Those educational aspirations were fueled by his determination to help young folks avoid some of the challenges he faced as a youth. In addition to being a prison abolitionist, he is also a world traveler, former collegiate athlete, and advocate for social justice. Jawara wants the world to be a better place, and he is playing his part to make it just that. Please extend a warm welcome to Jawara.
Nicholas, thank you so much for that warm welcome. Give me 1 second, I've got some, okay, here we go. So I'd like to congratulate Lily Corey and Lauren Nagel for the work they put into coordinating this event, and also for their dedication to supporting LGBTQ+ youth, particularly in foster care and the juvenile court systems. Such a great need for that. I'd also like to thank both of them for inviting me to speak today. I'm grateful, I'm honored. I'm also very excited to be here. I also want to, give a shout out to my friend Fahima Muhammad. She heard about this opportunity and for some reason thought I'd be a good candidate to speak. And just so you know, Fahima is also a former colleague of mine. And so she's seen me give plenty of presentations. She also knows that I sweat a lot during these presentations, like, even like running a marathon type sweat. But apparently she thought that my lived experience and my message was important enough that we could, hopefully look past the sweat. And I brought my trusty little hanky here in the event that I need to dry myself off at some point. But Fahima also plays a role in the King County Zero Youth Detention efforts. And so I also want to extend thank you for the work that she's doing to address youth incarceration. I'd also like to thank all of you for tuning in today. You are my fellow LGBTQ+ brothers and sisters. You are advocates, you are allies and the experts. You're the frontline workers, the miracle workers, the difference makers in the lives of our very precious LGBTQ+ youth. And I thank you for your service and the support that you give them. Next slide, please. So I am here because I too was a gay youth who experienced many of the same challenges that our LGBTQ+ youth are experiencing today. And that includes incarceration. I'm here today to share some of my story with the hopes that we recognize that despite some of the progress that we've made since the 90s, and yeah, I know that's kind of telling my age a bit, but we've still got, a ways to go in the advancement of equity and equality and inclusion for our LGBTQ+ youth. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you are also here today because we share the same interest in improving the conditions in our systems and in society so that our youth have a better sense of value and belonging. It is my hope that we all leave here feeling like we all have a significant role in creating a society where they too belong. Next slide, please. So Nicholas mentioned my academic accomplishments, so I won't bore you with that again. But just to give you a little more information about my background, I've worked in the field of social work for about 19 years in various capacities, a significant majority of that being youth focused. My first job in the field was with Creative Community Services, which is a therapeutic foster care agency in Stone Mountain, Georgia. They also have a program supporting adults with developmental disabilities to live independently. I was a family consultant case manager in that adult program, but I also provided support for their after-school program. I coordinated some activities for the youth program and often volunteered to chaperone or mentor some of the youth in the foster care program. It was that work experience that really confirmed that direct service was where not only I wanted to be, but needed to be. From there, I made my way back to North Carolina, where I provided direct service from individual support programming to director roles. One of the joys of that work, I had an opportunity to work one-on-one with a lot of youth, and majority of those youth had a number of challenges that they faced, and often I found myself in these staffing meetings as we discussed various cases, and as majority of the case managers would shy away, I had a tendency to volunteer to take on cases that seemed to be the most challenging. I saw that those were the youth that I felt like needed the most support. And I also felt like I had the skill set and the compassion and patience and determination to be the support that those youth needed. I eventually made my way to Seattle. I worked at the Seattle Children's Home, which is an inpatient mental health facility for youth. I got a taste of the corrections, the other side of corrections, as a resident monitor at one of the work release facilities run by Pioneer Human Services. I also worked as a youth development counselor at SYEP, also known as Seattle Youth Employment Program. And I ventured a bit into the policy world as a criminal justice strategic advisor with the Office for Civil Rights, with a primary focus on youth incarceration. And although I thoroughly enjoyed my experience there among an amazing team of folks, the policy world also confirmed that direct service is where I want and need to be. Despite my many years of professional experience, it is my personal experience as a gay formerly incarcerated youth that brings me here to speak today. Next slide, please. I just thought I'd throw up a couple pictures so that y'all could see what I looked like when I was sweet and innocent. I'm still sweet and innocent, so. But I'd like to share some of my life experiences as a black gay youth, a little bit more about my prison experience, and some of my personal views on addressing some of the challenges that our LGBTQ+ youth face even still today. So I was born and raised in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I'm the youngest of 5, but my sister was born just a couple years before me, so I forfeited my baby privileges because she was the only girl. I was fortunate to have both parents in the home, a slew of family on both sides that I had really close relationships with growing up. We were one of those families, and still are, one of those families where the aunts and uncles weren't just aunts and uncles. They were more of an extension of moms and dads. I was really close to my cousins, and they were, we spent a lot of time around each other. They were more like siblings. We lived in a neighborhood just outside of the city limits that was an equal mix of Black and white families. And many of those neighbors were really more of an extension of family instead of just people that lived next door. I was always pretty active throughout my youth. I played youth sports. I wasn't very good at them. I took piano lessons, wasn't really good at that either. I attended church regularly. I sang on the youth choir. I grew up in the Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. Fell one requirement short of my Eagle Scout award. But I was pretty good at fixing stuff. Usually after I break it, I'd end up fixing it or working on bikes and stuff like that. I was an above average student throughout school. I did just enough to make good grades, but I preferred exploring the woods and riding bikes and playing video games and all of the other kid stuff. But I definitely preferred all of that over reading a book or studying any day. Just a regular old kid. It was around my middle school years that sexual orientation became a factor in my life. Of course, I didn't know what that even was at the time. Instead of just seeing guys as friends I enjoyed hanging out with, I started having these physical attractions. One or two guys here or there, but not only that, there seemed to be like these feelings and these emotions attached. I recall to go to school on most days just so that I would have an opportunity to see them and hang out with them. Were these crushes? Absolutely. In hindsight, this wasn't where it all began though. I could go back as far as like first or second grade when I recall having very similar feelings and attractions. But back then it wasn't that big of a deal. Hadn't really thought much about it. It was really just enjoying my life being the kid. I will say that it did eventually create some internal conflict. As you're growing up as a boy, you remember so much time spent by some of the grown folks that you're around telling you, oh, you're gonna get you a girlfriend and you're gonna get married someday and you're gonna be a great husband to your wife and the routine. And the truth of the matter was, like, I actually had my first girlfriend while I was in middle school, and she was cool and all, but I wasn't really feeling it. I definitely wasn't having the same feelings that I had for those crushes. I remember having all sorts of questions just going through my head. Was this some kind of phase that all boys go through? Was I going to get in trouble for feeling this way? Was there something wrong with me? Is this even right? And from all those years around, growing up in the church, I just knew that this was an abomination. And as a result, I knew that, I had to keep that to myself. I thought too, maybe this is just a phase and eventually I'll grow out of it. Well, of course it wasn't. And I didn't. I'll fast forward a couple years when I turned 16. That's when things started getting a little dicey for me. Those feelings, those emotions, those attractions seemed to become even a bit stronger. But then I knew, around that time, like I knew there was no denying that I was gay. This was also like a phase in my life where I wanted to be liked. I wanted to have true friends outside of like my neighborhood and scouts. If there was one thing I knew for sure, being gay was not the way to accomplish that goal. There was one openly gay guy that I remember from school. And as unsure as I was of myself, in addition with my low self-esteem, there was no way that I could subject myself to the abuses that I witnessed him take. But throughout my life, no matter what, my social circle was, if you were a boy and you did something considered not boyish, the consequences were usually pretty harsh. And, that range of people was from, the white scout camp staff to the black deacon in the church and everybody in between. All too often you'd hear, don't be a sissy, or you're a little punk, or you're a fag. And of course, the list goes on. And, depending on who was hurling those insults, sometimes that abuse was even physical. And so I learned early on that not to be gay, at least not in the open. But there were so many other impactful changes that happened in my life at the age of 16. We moved out of our neighborhood, the neighborhood that I'd always lived in, all the way on the other side of town. The farthest away from my circle of friends. My sister moved away for college, just a few years removed from all three of my brothers joining the military. And I don't think it was until then that I realized how important they were to me. And the sibling rivalry was real. And I know there was a part of me that was grateful that they were gone and I had all of this space and time to myself. But I think them, moving away really just highlighted the void in my life, left from not having people or spaces that I could express like my identity to. The internet ended up becoming my best friend, and believe it or not, it's been around much longer than some folks think. And it wasn't just new technology to explore. For me, it primarily served as my connection to the gay world. America Online, AOL, that was the platform back then, maybe obsolete now. It wasn't long before I discovered the male for male chat rooms, began connecting with other gay folks from all over the world pretty much. From what I remember, most of those rooms were full of guys that were much older than me. And honestly, that didn't matter in the least bit. It was really the only option that I had that I knew of where I could go and I could be myself without judgment or without much concern about anything. I also got my license at the age of 16, and although I didn't have my own car, I had access to one. To this day, I have no idea how I discovered where the gay clubs were in the city, but I did. And on rare occasions when I could get out a little later, it wasn't often at all, but I would cruise around the block of the gay club, hoping to make some new friends. There's a part of me, I think, that was just curious to see, the other side of my world. And that was definitely an opportunity that I took advantage of, the few times that I could. There were even a few times that I met guys while cruising. Of course, they were always much older, but at the same time, it was one of only two ways that I had discovered that to fill the void that I felt I was missing in my life. It wasn't the healthiest nor the safest way to connect. but it was, my way of being able to explore. Nowadays, so much easier. That exploration is, pretty much at, folks' fingertips. You've got apps, where, meeting locals nearby. I also still don't think that it's the safest and healthiest way for our young folks. But if it's the only option that they have, you best believe that they're gonna use it. And I think that's why it's so important that, we create these spaces that are safe and that are healthy, pro-social ways for our LGBTQ youth to be themselves. As I mentioned previously, after we moved, after my siblings left, I sought ways to find, replacements for them. We had a pretty close-knit family. We spent a significant amount of time together. And I began, socializing with probably not the most favorable group of people to hang out with, but they did become my friends. We spent, spent plenty of time, partying and drinking and smoking weed. Those were all ways that kind of helped me cope with some of the complexities of my life. We often, got into scuffles at parties or, ended up finding some way to get in trouble somehow. Even though like I wasn't the troublemaking kid, this actually became a part of my life, just with this association with this group of folks. But I also realized that it was, just another way for me to show my toughness. Just another purpose of masking, another way of masking like my identity. It was during that time of my life where I longed to fit in, and I found that this was a way for me to do that. And so playing that tough guy role was just another way that, I could mask my my identity. Around that time, I also discovered wrestling. Finally, a sport that I was actually good at. After only 2 years of wrestling in high school, I represented North Carolina in the junior nationals in freestyle and Greco-Roman wrestling. Following graduation, I joined the team at Pembroke State University. And as much as I loved the sport, which also fulfilled, that need to be considered tough, the burden of masking my identity only seemed to intensify, being a part on that college team. And finally, I found something that I really loved doing, but it still felt, I couldn't be myself doing it. And that in itself was a bit depressing. I'd actually debated whether or not to even return to school my junior year. I was already, a bit overwhelmed. It had finally come to be, a bit too much in my life, to live a lie for all of those years. And so I, contemplated not going back. That's one less environment that I had to play this role and not really be myself. Unfortunately, during that summer, just 2 days before my 19th birthday, my grandfather died suddenly. He was the only grandparent I'd ever known. He was very near and dear to me. It was, really a devastating loss. And really, really depressing. After that, I lost interest in things that were really important to me. I decided to quit the wrestling team. I quit school. I moved back home. Coping with his life seemed at that time to be the most difficult thing that I'd ever had to deal with. I feel like I was already at that breaking point, and this was the thing that, pretty much took me over the edge. I started drinking more, excessively. I started smoking more weed. I started spending more time with that group of folks that, weren't actually the best company. I really did stop caring about a lot of things that I cared about, with the exception of hiding my identity. That was still something that was at the very forefront of my life. I made some really poor decisions. And it was one of those decisions that, would eventually cost me what should have been some of the best days of my life. So I committed an armed robbery. I was, out with this group of friends. We often, made some really bad decisions. This was just one of them. And the first time that something like this would come back to get me. Make a long story short, I was tried and convicted of robbery with a dangerous weapon and sentenced to a 14-year, 7-year mandatory sentence in the North Carolina Department of Corrections. Back then, armed robbery was one of the mandatory minimum sentences. And regardless of, that was the lowest sentence that you would receive for that offense. I reflected quite a bit, like after that happened. I often thought, like, how could I end up, in the position that I was in? I'd actually never been in trouble before. I was, grew up in the Scouts, as I previously mentioned. I was a mentor to I probably had about 8 or 9 nieces and nephews at the time. I spent time helping them with their homework, really involved in their lives. I was a good friend to all of the people that I knew. I often even went back to my high school to teach a lot of those guys, some of the things that I learned as a collegiate wrestler. So I was never seen as like the bad kid. I even remember, like, maybe a couple weeks into my prison sentence, running into one of the guys who lived in a neighboring in one of the neighborhoods close to mine. And when he saw me, he was just looked at me and was like, "Dude, what are you doing here?" So I was never like that kid that anyone expected to end up where I was, but there I was. And I can't attribute anything more to me ending up where I was than the lie that I continued to live, throughout my youth. I realized at the very beginning of my sentence that the system was not designed for me to leave there better off than I was when I went in. Not quite sure, where I got the wherewithal, to recognize that. But I did make a commitment to myself to do everything that I could to avoid ending up spending any more time in there than I had to. I abandoned all of the behaviors that I had adopted. I stopped trying to be the tough guy. really got back to being my true self. I found myself often being the mentor. There are a lot of folks that looked up to me because I was finished 2 years in college and I was a college athlete and whatnot. I spent the first little over a year, I think, in youth detention. There was any of the guys that hadn't completed their GED or high school diploma were required to take classes for their GED. And one of my jobs there, working in the schoolhouse, with taking attendance and everything. But I often had an opportunity to tutor some of those guys and help them accomplish that goal of completing their high school equivalency. I also wanted to make sure that I stayed engaged and stayed involved, and I registered to take correspondence courses at from the University of North Carolina, which in itself was a bit challenging because they wouldn't allow textbooks in. So it's kind of difficult, to complete a course when you don't have access to the text. But there are a number of things that I did to help keep me busy. I was one of the charter members for a group at that particular facility called Prisoners Against Crime. It was just a group of about 10 inmates who wrote bi-monthly newsletters to be circulated around some of the local middle schools, pretty much to serve as a deterrent for some of the youth who were headed on a little off track. I would be, in the eyes of some folks, I think I would be seen as the success story. And I could even see some folks using my story as justification for the current system that we have. But I do have to admit that that system had absolutely nothing to do with my success. I too experienced harm through that system. I don't believe that anybody leaves those gates or those walls unscathed. And but even still today, I've had bouts with depression. I've had suicidal thoughts. I've struggled with addiction from alcohol or drugs or gambling. There are a number of things that I can attribute to the failures of that system. Next slide, please. I think a question that we really have to ask ourselves is, what purpose does our current legal system serve? Is it to reduce crime? Is it making communities safer? And I think the simple answer to those questions is an emphatic no. Because I clearly want to, understand the purpose the system has. And so I think we have to dig a little further and ask ourselves, just a few more questions. Is it educating our youth? Aside from, mandatory GED courses, are youth having opportunities to further their education, while they're incarcerated? I mentioned the difficulty I had attempting to take correspondence courses. I don't know that has changed any. And I don't see the current system doing anything that provides opportunities for our youth to advance their education while they're there, despite the facts that there is a correlation with higher levels of education and lower levels of recidivism. So we have this information, we know it, but we're not investing in education for our youth within these systems. I think another question we have to ask is it addressing any of the challenges our youth faced prior to incarceration? When you think in terms of mental health, are they receiving, adequate therapeutic services? Or think in terms of homelessness, or is this system, preparing them to re-enter society with, a place to stay? We can think of a number of challenges: addiction, suicide. I mean, you name it. There are a number of issues that, many of our youth who are incarcerated, many of them are facing. And I think we really have to be honest about the system actually being more harmful and creating more challenges for our youth than they had when they went in. I think another question we have to ask is it building stronger relationships between the youth and their support systems? I think, this question is so broad. I think about the impact that my incarceration had on my family and loved ones. Fortunately, my family had access to a car, and so they could come and visit me on a regular basis. They could afford to, they could afford to accept my phone calls. And so there wasn't as much of a disconnect with my family during my experience, but what I have learned as of late, as a friend of mine who's incarcerated, and the amount that it costs to stay in contact with your loved ones is ridiculous. And I think I put like $10 on a friend's phone card, a few weeks ago, and it cost $25. Fortunately, I was in a position where I, had the money to do that. But I think all too often, you've got families that are struggling, that are living in poverty, and, they don't have the access to a vehicle to travel, miles away from home to visit a loved one. They don't have the funds to stay connected, even via phone. And so we're not, the system is not helping to build stronger relationships with, between youth and their support systems. I think another question we have to ask, is it providing our youth with the tools necessary, to get out and find a job and keep a job? Are there vocational educational programs, within this system? Are there job readiness, training programs within this system? I don't think that there are. And so, we can ask a number of questions that are really related to the value in the current system that we have. And I honestly don't think there is any. And that's the unfortunate part. But I also want to touch on the detriment that being within, this system tends to have on youth. And I'll use just one example. LGBTQ plus youth, with within those systems, particularly youth detention, experience solitary confinement, more frequently than the other youth. And from my personal experience, I happened to witness that myself. I was not out during the time I spent in youth facility, but I also witnessed, the treatment of my LGBTQ plus brothers inside, and constant harassment, constant ridicule. And this is often like not just from other inmates, but also from staff alike. There's always like the threat of physical harm, and often, the safest place for LGBTQ plus youth was solitary confinement. I happened to spend a couple stints in solitary confinement myself during my period of incarceration. And I have to say it was the most dehumanizing experience that I had ever experienced in my life. And my reason for actually going to solitary confinement was because I didn't get out of my bed fast enough. And so the correctional officer had an issue with that. And I ended up spending 5 days in solitary confinement. Because I was falsely accused of threatening him, and that was his way of getting back at me for not responding as quickly as he wanted me to. But there's a reason that they call it the hole. If you can imagine just being locked up in your closet in the dark, with maybe the door slightly open, and that is pretty much like that ray of light that you would get through that very tiny window in that room, or in that cell rather. The walls were dark, and depending on the officers on duty, you may or may not get your hour outside. If you did, it was hardly ever a full hour, and you'd be lucky to get half of that even. And but that was definitely, one of the experiences that that I think definitely has to change, because it is so detrimental to like the mental health of it should be abolished altogether. But it's clear to me that the system isn't functioning the way that we would like it to. It's also clear that there are more folks in power that feel like this is an appropriate system for our youth to be in. And I couldn't disagree more. Next slide, please. And I'm sure, excuse me. These are some of the cost of our youth being incarcerated. And we know that there's a higher rate of suicide. We know that there's mental health issues that aren't addressed. And the fact that we know that all of these issues are a result of, or a continuation of, for our youth as a result of being incarcerated. And so it leads me to wonder why we are currently still utilizing a system that we know does not work and is not in the best interest of our young folks. Next slide, please. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with this show. It's actually one of my favorite shows, particularly because it plays out these various scenarios of real life situations. So what would you do? I think I can think of a number of real life situations, aside from mine even, that if we polled the audience here today, I think if you heard some story about a youth who was homeless and broke into a store to as the only way to find something to eat, I think all of us would be in agreement that the most appropriate response to that is not sending this kid to jail, but maybe connecting them with a social worker who can conduct an assessment to determine like what the needs of that youth is, and developing an action plan to help them, help them overcome some of those challenges. I am also pretty certain that if we polled, if we conducted a national poll, that majority of the folks would also be in agreement that, despite what the situation is, that the most appropriate response would be, the same. And that's whether it's a robbery or whether it's an assault. I think, we have to recognize that there are underlying issues that lead to some of this behavior. And if we're not addressing those, then we're doing a disservice to not just that youth, but also to society. Next slide, please. So here's an illustration that I found that I think is a clear representation of what tends to be controversial in some groups with defunding the police. And I think it clearly shows where there's a whole lot of responsibility that's put on police officers and police departments that shouldn't be. And so when I think in terms of like defunding the police, I think about all of the other ways that we could utilize some of that funding to support LGBTQ plus youth experiencing crisis. Next slide, please. So have we made any progress? A lot has changed, I think, since my day, since my youth. We've seen movements across the country for criminal justice reform. We've seen, highlighting, diversion programs, well, highlighting the prevalence of suicide and the cruelty of solitary confinement, charging youth as an adult, as adults, homelessness. We've seen, community organizations, grassroots organizations taking, calling for alternatives to incarceration. We've got diversion programs that I know that they're implementing in Seattle as a means of keeping our young folks out of jail and prison. Both the city and the county have allocated funding to support youth programs. I've actually played a part in some of that decision making. And it's been great to actually see LGBTQ plus youth prioritized in that discourse. Have we made progress? I've witnessed like my straight friends standing up, for folks, for LGBTQ plus folks. I've seen a scale back, I think, in derogatory and offensive language. Have we made any progress? I think representation matters. I don't, just recently, I think it may have been last week or maybe the week before, a current NFL player, Carl Nassib, announced that he was gay. Next slide, please. And so I think, you know, we are seeing a shift, not necessarily a shift, but we're seeing, you know, efforts being made on the systemic level. But I think it's just as equally important that we make adjustments on that social level. And next slide. So there've been a number of celebrities over the past few years who have come out. I've just pictured a few of them here. We've got Lori Lightfoot, we've got Lil Nas X. You know, kudos to Dwayne Wade and Gabrielle Union for the support that they are providing their daughter Zaya. And so important. And I think there are some folks that I've heard, oh, you know, what's the big deal? I think it's a big deal that we have these celebrities because they also at some point were gay youth. They've also probably experienced some of the same challenges that our youth are experiencing today. And their platforms are so far reaching. And so if there's a fan of one of these folks that, you know, if this is what it takes for one of them to come to the realization that they should view LGBTQ plus folks differently, then I'll take that. But I think it also, you know, I can't recall during my youth, you know, having a representation of folks in politics and sports and music, you know, to look up to. And so I think, you know, having folks in these different specters is really important for our youth. When I moved to Seattle, I was introduced to gay sports leagues. Never knew that such a thing even existed. They definitely weren't around in North Carolina. And in all honesty, I think the gay leagues in Seattle are actually better than the straight leagues. And I mean, they're so good that like a lot of straight folks are even crossing over, you know, to play. And so I've started using, instead of using the term gay friendly, I've been using straight friendly because a lot of the leagues are very welcoming of our straight counterparts. But you know, nothing warms my heart more than like common folks story, you know, hearing or seeing like, you know, stories about common folks and representing. And so every year I go to, there's a sports tournament, there's an LGBTQ plus sports event held in Vegas during MLK weekend. Participants in I think about 24 different sports, from kickball to ice hockey. There are about 8,000 athletes from all over the country. And so last January, I actually competed there, and we were out for a team dinner, and saw this kid with this hat on, and I thought, oh, it must be somebody's birthday. And you know, I'm one of those folks that like, I talk to strangers all the time, and it gets a little annoying, I think, to some of my friends, because it's like, they're like, hey, dude, you have to talk to everybody. And I'm like, yeah, I have to talk to everybody. But particularly when folks are celebrating, I'm always curious to know what's going on. And so when I saw this guy, I was like, hey, dude, it's somebody's birthday? And he's like, no, we're actually celebrating my friend coming out as gay. And, you know, kind of shocked me a bit, because it was not the response that I was expecting. But, you know, he told me that they were on the same football team, that his friend had just come out, and they were out there celebrating with him. And I couldn't, in that moment, it was really hard to believe. And it's like, have I been living under a rock somewhere? Like, is this how folks are coming out nowadays? But also in that moment, I thought about myself and how beneficial that would have been to me as, I'm going to say these kids were probably 15 or 16-ish, to have a support network of friends. And in addition to that, having a group of dads that were also just as supportive. And that was mind blowing to me. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Carl Nassib was the NFL player that previously mentioned, just recently came out. There are so many benefits to LGBTQ plus youth from having and accepting adults in their lives. This is just one of them. And I really want to you all to know that this stat, is really every one of you. Every one of you are making a difference in the lives of our young folks. Next slide, please. So I have just like a few messages that I want to shout out to folks. A message to the LGBTQ plus allies. I can't thank you enough for, checking the bullies and showing up at events and using your privileged voices to stand up for equity and equality for our youth. A message to service providers. Thank you so much for your support. You are the ones providing a warm welcome and safe space for our youth. You are the ones on the front line showing the support that some of them can't get anywhere else. You are the ones that are helping our youth feel good about who they are, helping them to cope with some of the madness they've had to endure. To our political leaders and policymakers, you are in a position of power and influence. You have the data and the science that informs you that the current youth legal system does not work. You have the persuasive skills to talk your opposition into believing and recognizing the benefits of reforming the current system. And so I'm calling on you, to, create legislation that is going to reverse the conditions that many of our youth are facing. To the family and caregivers, your love is necessary. It is, you are like the foremost, the first people in our LGBTQ plus youth's lives. They need your support. They need your love. They need your concern. They need your commitment to their lives and their well-being. To stakeholders, we appreciate putting your money where your mouth is. Your youth appreciate it. Our youth appreciate it as well. I know that you understand the difference your commitment, your advocacy, and your dollars are making in the lives of our youth. Please continue to give that support, and it's well worth the investment. I also want to give a shout out to our LGBTQ plus youth. These are my younger LGBTQ brothers and sisters. I can't express enough how proud I am of you. You come out despite the challenges that you'll face in today's society, and you have embraced your true selves. You have set an example for so many other LGBTQ plus youth that are following in your footsteps. I saw a meme on Facebook, I think it may have been last week, but it read, "Keep being you, the world will adjust." You are the main reason that folks are starting to understand. You are the ones that are forcing the world to shift in a positive direction. And those days of being bullied and feeling isolated, I really feel like they're nearing their end. So please know that you are valued, that you are loved, and that we got your back. I want to take like one minute, because collectively, I think all of us know, some youth that has been impacted by these systems. And so I want us to kind of take a minute, if you could all just think of one youth that you know, an LGBTQ plus youth that you know, and it could be anyone. It could be a son or a daughter, a neighbor, a friend. It could be someone that you've worked with. Could be someone that that you just know. And I want you to just take a few seconds to think about some of the challenges that they face, whether it's been homelessness, addiction, isolation, loneliness, whatever the case. But I also want you to think about one thing that you can do to help alleviate some of the pain and that they've experienced. And it's my hope that you'll actually, continue to be as supportive as you have been. And although we envision like this world where, our youth have this sense of belonging, this society where, there's equity and there's inclusion, I think the reality is we still aren't far enough along for our young folks to realize that dream. In closing, I know I'm running out of time, but so I envisioned there's a friend that I met just a few months ago. Actually, about 2 months before I was introduced to this opportunity. And honestly, I don't think I would have accepted this opportunity had it not been for this person. But I had just moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, just before the pandemic blew up. But as things started to open up, I started reaching out so that I could make some new friends there. And, social media, I met this guy. We shared some common interests like playing basketball and some other things. And so decided that we would hang out. We would go and shoot ball. And I picked him up, and during our conversation, and I think I was just like, "Hey, dude, so how long you been living in Charlotte?" And he's, "Oh, dude, I just got out of prison like 2 weeks ago." And it's like, wow. And so, I'll just call him Robbie just for identification purposes. Keep that confidential. But he had also identified himself as bi. And while hanging out with Robbie this one time, I heard, overheard a conversation that, an argument that he was having with someone over the phone. And I asked him about that later. I was like, dude, are these really the type of people that you feel like you need to be hanging out with? It just seemed like it just wasn't a good match, and had the potential to get him in some further trouble. But later on, I ended up having a conversation with Robbie because there were so many things about him that reminded me of myself. And so I asked him, I said, "Hey, dude, have you ever thought about how much your sexual orientation plays into your interactions with other people, particularly, trying to portray this tough guy image, which is what I got from the interactions that I had with him. Unfortunately, Robbie was in some in the company of some not so great folks. Robbie is back in prison, and what I've learned is that Robbie's been in and out of the system since he was about 15, and he's 29 now. And so it really makes me question, how does any youth that goes into this system multiple times not come out better than they were? And so I think that's one of the things that we have to ask ourselves, if this system is not working, because the system should have, that first or second time, if the system did what we needed it to do, then there wouldn't be repeat offenders. There wouldn't be more Robbies who got going in and out of these systems. And so we've got our work to do. The cost of doing nothing, results in more stories like Robbie, continued issues with mental health, continued high rates of suicide. And so my challenge to all of you is, be mindful that like this system does not work, and we have to do everything in our power to ensure that the youth that are coming behind us don't experience more detriment as a result. So thank you so much for coming. Thanks for having me, and happy Pride.
Thank you so much, Jawara. And everyone, please join me in whatever Zoom form of gratitude you can show, emojis, but just thank you so much. I personally am leaving much more educated, motivated, and inspired today. So thank you. And so next up, we have our plenary speaker, Aisha Canfield. For almost a decade, Aisha has conducted research on the disproportionate detention of a lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, gender non-conforming, transgender, Black, Indigenous, person of color youth, so LGBTQ, GNCT, BIPOC, quite a mouthful there, and their pathways into the justice system. Her research was the first to establish that 20% of youth and juvenile detention facilities nationally are LGBTQ, and that 85% of those youth are also BIPOC. With a growing need for jurisdiction-specific data, Aisha also provides training and technical assistance to juvenile probation departments to improve data collection processes that allow agencies to give youth an opportunity to disclose their sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, or SOGI. Additionally, Aisha serves as an evaluation partner to community-based organizations who are serving as healing alternatives to traditional justice system responses for LGBTQ, GNCT youth of color. Through her work, Aisha seeks to reclaim research and data as accessible advocacy tools for BIPOC youth, their families, communities, and the practitioners working on behalf of their well-being and liberation. Aisha is reminded of the importance of creating thriving and liberated communities through her own journey as a Black and queer mother to her empathic, and unashamedly confident 3-year-old daughter. Welcome, Aisha.
Hi, thank you so much. And I'm going to ask for some forgiveness. My very empathic and confident 3-year-old is with me today because she is not feeling well. So we will do our best. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right, so I just want to make sure folks can see my screen. I'm just going to head nod. Yes, all good? Okay. All right, so thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to be talking about counting youth as whole people, exploring the role of SOGI data collection and the transformation of the youth justice system. And before I get started, I realize that some folks may not be familiar with the term SOGI. And SOGI stands for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And while our focus, a lot of my focus is on LGBT youth, I think it's really important for us to use SOGI as a framework to explore the ways in which we all fall along the spectrum of sexual orientation. We all fall along the spectrum of gender identity, and we all fall along the spectrum of gender expression. I think also often what what gets missed when we just talk about LGBT youth are folks who don't necessarily identify with a label or identify with the LGBT community or consider themselves to be straight and cisgender, but are also gender nonconforming and get misread as being part of the community. So again, while I'll be focusing a lot on LGBT youth, I think it's just important to introduce SOGI as a framework. So I thought we would start with a quiz to get folks engaged and interacting. This is research that doesn't come just from my organization. We've pulled it from a lot of different experts in the field. And it's really to reinforce and highlight the importance of thinking about this population, which all of you are already doing, obviously, but also to reinforce the need for consistent and quality data. A lot of what is in this quiz are from surveys, one-time snapshots, which are great and important, but we really need to be collecting data on a consistent basis. So I am the least tech savvy person I know, so I think Lily pulled a poll together for me, or am I doing the poll? You're doing it. Fabulous, because that's too much multitasking. Okay, so quiz question 1, y'all. Approximately what % of homeless youth are LGBT nationwide? All right, how's it going?
We're about 70%. Gonna give folks about 10 more seconds.
Come on, y'all. We got to participate in democracy. Vote.
We promise that it's anonymous. We say
It's anonymous. Yeah. It is not tied to your pay scale or anything. Nobody's going to find out.
no one's getting a grade at the end of this. So.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll.
Okay. All right, so it looks like 3% said 5 to 10%, 22% said 15 to 20%, and 75% said 30 to 35%. So the answer, I realize that this is different. It is technically 30 to 40% of homeless youth are LGBT. So what this means is that relative to the general population, LGBT youth are incredibly overrepresented in the homeless population. And this is not something that's surprising. We know that housing and family rejection and issues with child welfare placements, I mean, we can really understand the trajectory into homelessness. All right, quiz question 2. What % of youth in detention facilities nationwide are lesbian, gay, bisexual, questioning, or gender nonconforming and transgender? If you were listening to my bio, which I realized I should probably simplify, you would have heard this percentage in there. So A, 6 to 7%, B, 20%, or C, 40%.
Gonna give folks about 5 more seconds.
All right, so it looks like none of you said 6 to 7%. 59% of you said 20%, and 41% of you said 40%. Excellent. Yeah. So 20% of youth in detention facilities nationwide are LGBTQ or gender nonconforming. That 6 to 7%, that was the last statistic I saw around the percent of the general youth population that identifies as such. Now, I don't know if that's gone up or changed, but regardless, LGBT youth are about 3 times overrepresented in the juvenile justice system. So this is about like 1 in every 5 young people who are in our facilities identify as such. Quiz question 3. What percent of youth in foster care are LGBTQ?
Gonna give folks about 5 more seconds.
Okay, so 23% of you said 19%, 52% of you said 29%, and 26% of you said 39%. So the answer for this is a 19%. After I put this quiz together, I think a study came out that the percentage is actually much higher. Another study was done, I believe, in New York, and it looks like I believe it's closer to 30%. What I think is really interesting about this 19% that Bianca Wilson found was that it's really similar to our percentage of young people in the juvenile justice system. One second, my love. And so that 20 and 19%, we know that young people are also overrepresented in both systems, right? So these are young people potentially that are crossing over back and forth. But with research, I just want to say that it is likely that all of you were right, depending on where you are, right? Because we know that for a myriad of reasons, young people don't feel safe coming out when their system involved. Okay, question 4. One second. Girls with same-sex attraction are more likely to be disciplined in school than boys with same-sex attraction.
Gonna give folks about 5 more seconds.
So 36% of you said this is true, and 64% of you said this is false. And the answer is actually true. Girls with same-sex attraction are 95% more likely to be disciplined. This was a really interesting study that I think is worth further study. We don't exactly know why this is true. Oftentimes when we think about discipline around sexual orientation or gender expression, we think about boys, right? And how hard boys have it. So again, we don't know why this is the way it is, but I thought it was an important study to highlight, particularly around the trajectory of school discipline and young people's attachment to school for LGBT youth, and what happens when that connection gets broken, and what happens later down the line around justice system involvement. I know I think this young person I put up here is beautiful. This is not a picture from the study, but I'd be really curious also what happens when you combine sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and race, obviously, in this study. Okay, what percentage of girls in detention facilities nationally identify as LGBTQ GNCT?
Gonna give folks about 5 more seconds.
Okay, so 10% of you said 6 to 7%, 47% of you said 20%, and 44% of you said 40%. And the answer is 40%. And it's, I think it's really heartening that such a high percentage of you got that right, because that's an incredibly high percentage. And most people don't assume that there are that many LGBTQ, GNCT girls in our justice system. We hear from folks who are working inside of facilities that they know this to be true. And so I don't know if any of you are working inside of a facility, but 40% is incredibly high. That's nationally. I'm in California. And when we run that statistic, that data here for just California facilities, we see that number shoot up to 50%. So again, 1 out of every 2 girls, it's really high. But I pair this with the quiz question before to just, again, draw some parallels between school discipline and ending up in the youth justice system. Okay, the majority of LGBTQ and GNCT youth in juvenile detention facilities are white.
Gonna give folks about 5 more seconds.
All right, so 20% of you said true and 80% of you said false. And the answer is false. 85% of LGBTQ and GNCT youth in detention facilities are youth of color. So I used to also ask folks who were working in probation and other systems this question maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And the majority overwhelmingly would say that this is true, that the highest percentage of LGBT youth in the justice system were white. And I think a lot of that had to do with the imagery we're all exposed to around who is LGBT. And that's often, historically, has often been white folks, right? You look at movies or in the media or celebrities that are coming out, and often the top stories, messages would be white folks. But we know that the majority of youth in the justice system are youth of color, right? So it makes sense that the majority of LGBT youth would also be of color. So it's important for us to continue to push ourselves to think intersectionally, to recognize that LGBT youth exists within communities of color. I know that there's also been sort of this discord that communities of color are more homophobic. There's studies that have proven that actually not to be true. So again, when we're thinking about serving LGBT youth who are system involved, whether that's child welfare or juvenile justice, we need to also be thinking that these are young people who are also coming from communities of color, maybe undocumented, right? There are all these layers of identity that we need to be asking young people, which ones can we better support them around? Because it may not always be their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. It could be that they're undocumented. It could be it could be a lot of different things. But I really love this question because it just sort of brings multiple identities together in one. All right, so thank you, Lily, for the poll support. And thank you all for voting and participating. Okay, so what is the Whole Youth Project? It's an initiative that's been in the works for a really long time with my organization. A number of years ago, we piloted a training essentially with a number of counties in the Central Valley here in California, which tend to be more rural and more conservative. I live in the Bay Area. So Central Valley tends to be more red than Bay Area or certainly LA. And they were interested in collecting SOGI data and working with LGBT youth. And it came sort of on the tails of working around girls and thinking about girls in the juvenile justice system. And I think that created just a door for folks to start thinking about LGBT youth. I think, you know, girls' work has been great and helpful, but it's important that we think about, again, that SOGI framework, that boys also have a gender, and that there are more than just two genders. And so I'm grateful for the girls' work that it allowed us to start having these conversations, but it's been important to continue to move the dial to think about youth more broadly. And so also at the same time, around the same time, the PREA standards had been released and folks were starting to think about how to serve LGBTI folks that were in detention facilities. And PREA stands for the Prison Rape Elimination Act. That was a set of federal standards that came out to really work with facilities to bring down the high rates of sexual abuse inside of both youth and adult facilities. So we piloted this project to just try out talking about LGBT youth inside of a detention facility, begin collecting the data, and it was really successful. And we were hearing more and more need for support around implementing this and supporting probation departments to better support LGBT youth. And so a number of years went by, and as language and identities evolve, we wanted to make sure that the project too evolved. So we held a number of focus groups after that first pilot with young people, system involved and not system involved, in multiple states and across race and ethnicity, and wanted to check in about the language. You know, what should we be asking? How should we be asking it? Probation departments only have, you know, so much space in their case management systems for drop-down options. So we really, you know, we don't want to exclude any identities, but we're working with a limited number of spaces. And so we really developed this initiative based off of language and the needs and the identities of young people that would be part, you know, that would hopefully be benefiting from this initiative. And so we expanded the project, and we've pulled in now probation departments all over the country who want to implement SOGI data collection into their existing case management systems and really want to make data-driven decisions on how to better serve LGBT youth, but really youth across race and SOGI. And so this initiative entails training, and we spend a lot of time going over that language and terminology, because what we've found is that language is often a barrier for folks to create meaningful relationships, right? No matter where you fall on this topic, whether you struggle with it or you're completely an ally or an accomplice, nobody wants to say something that's offensive, right? And the LGBT community, there's a lot of language that folks get really intimidated by. And so we spend a lot of time on language to develop vernacular so that folks can begin to adopt new terms and new concepts into their tool belt so that they can have meaningful conversations with young people who come into the facilities. And language isn't a barrier, right, to really being able to have an authentic conversation with young folks. We go over a lot of that data that I just presented to you, and we have a much longer version. But for folks who are working in facilities and are stretched really thin, times when they hear they're going to be collecting data from young people, this is just one more thing that I don't have time for, we don't have the capacity for. We get a lot of questions around why are we doing this? We've also heard that, well, we don't have any LGBT kids in our facilities, right? Or we've only had, quote, one of those. But when you look at that data, we know that that's not true. We know that LGBT youth are overrepresented in the system. And so a lot of that data that we present to them really reinforces the need to collect SOGI data and brings visibility that there are LGBT young people who are cycling in and out of the youth justice system and child welfare and homelessness and school pushout. And so for a lot of people, it's that data that's really compelling, right? That really moves them to think about this population and this topic differently. And then we get into practicing what the questions are that are going to be in the case management systems, and how do you ask them in a way that's conversational. You don't want to ask, are you gay? Are you lesbian? Right? But how do you ask, like, tell me about the important relationships that you have in your life. Tell me about the important people in your life. Tell me about the things that what activities do you like to do? What youth centers do you like to go to, right? And really start asking young people, not pigeonholing them into a certain community or identity, but leaning in with curiosity around who they are and how those identities really shape their lives, what activities they like to participate in, what activities they wish they had more of. Young people aren't going to be in our detention facilities forever, right? They're going to go home. They're going to go back to their communities. They're going to go back to their neighborhoods. And so we as advocates or practitioners really need to be thinking about how to support young people where they're needing support and where there's a lack of resources, but also how to uphold and magnify their interests, their strengths, and their gifts. And then we think a lot about working with the facilities. Where's that data going to live? Who's going to have access to it? How do we make sure that young people are who are going to share their SOGI with us? How are they protected? How is that data kept confidential, while also using it to make appropriate case planning decisions? So we need to help facilities develop non-discrimination policies, train on those policies. Also, data protection and sharing policies are really important as well. And then we work with folks to get trained up. We really like the T for T model. So everybody comes to the first several trainings, and then we work with a core group of trainers at the end of the training period to be able to deliver the material. And this is a really important component, I think, because we're working with probation departments that are not just in the Bay Area, right? They're all over the country. There's different nuances around this topic. There's different nuances around the youth justice system. There are cultural nuances that we are not experts in. And so we like to provide a foundation around the knowledge around this topic, but really it's up to the departments to combine that and to mesh that with the challenges and the culture of their specific facilities or specific jurisdictions, and deliver in a way that is much more credible in some ways than we are, because these are folks who are in the work day to day, understand the staff, understand young people, understand communities in a different way. Change the case management systems, and folks start collecting the data either at intake and or booking. And we let this happen for several months, and then we ask for a data dump, and we see what the preliminary findings are. We've done this enough now that we know we have an idea where this percentages should fall. And so if things are really low, if percentages are low, that tends to be an opportunity to go in and do some quality assurance. Maybe we work with the department to understand like what's happening when you ask the questions, who's asking the questions, could they get a little bit more support? We have found that every jurisdiction has been different. Sometimes generally nursing staff in the facilities have yielded really great responses. And part of that, I think, is because they're used to asking young people some really personal questions. But we've also gotten departments where intake and booking are just, they're excited to do this, they're ready to do this, they've been wanting to know how to do this, and they're really able to yield us some really great data. So once we do the quality assurance, check in and offer a little bit more TA and support where needed, we let the folks continue to ask the questions for about another year, actually, because we want to get a really great database. During that time, we have the sites participate in peer-to-peer facilitated calls. And this has been really helpful because, again, I and my colleagues don't work in a facility, don't work in a probation department every day, but it's been really valuable for probation departments to talk to one another and to hear the similarities and the challenges that come up in undertaking an initiative like this. And part of it is like, how do we change hearts and minds? The youth justice system has really been anchored in this idea of you're either a boy or you're a girl, and we need to keep you separate under the guise of like safety, not realizing how much harm that binary thinking or that paradigm has caused on a number of youth, including youth who are just cisgender boys or cisgender girls, right? Like, how do we confine young people to these really narrow definitions of what it means to be a boy or a girl or straight or just gay, right? We know again that many youth exist along this spectrum or are exploring. And there's also been a culture of like, don't ask, don't tell. That's none of my business. In fact, it's bordering inappropriate behavior for me to ask you who you're attracted to or what kind of relationship you're involved in. And so probation departments on these peer-to-peer calls can really work with one another to share best practices and share lessons learned and to strategize together on how to address some of those things that might come up. We are also going to be changing these calls a little bit to host guest speakers to talk about really important topics that might come up, like the topic of religion, right? How do we work with religious staff or with religious families around this topic? How do we think about, what's next, right? Like, now that we have the data, how do we turn this data into decision making? So that's basically the initiative in a nutshell. It's a 2-year engagement period, but we haven't had any sites actually decide to drop off after the 2 years. So I think that that's a good sign that folks are getting a lot of use out of this and are really excited to see what their data shows. So our current project sites are Ohio, we have Cuyahoga, Franklin, Summit, Lucas, and Montgomery counties. In New York, we're working with Schenectady, Suffolk, Onondaga, and New York City. In California, we're working with LA, Santa Clara, Santa Barbara, and Contra Costa counties. We are working with the state of Connecticut, and we are working with LaPorte County in Indiana. And there are going to be opportunities for other sites to join. We're looking at Fulton County, which is Atlanta, Hawaii, King County, Pierce County. So we're expanding, and it's really, really exciting. I think we should all be really excited that the field is moving in this direction to really explicitly think about and support and consider reforms that center LGBT youth, again, who are also mostly of color. So just some initial findings from our first round of data analysis. We found that 15.4% of youth in our sites in detention facilities identifies LGBTQ GNCT. 32.7% of youth assigned female at birth identify as LGBTQ GNCT. And so again, if we go back to that national data, we're really close, right? That 20% of youth identify as such, and that almost 40% of girls. So again, I think it's really promising that the data is pretty consistent. I also want to say that it's been COVID. And so there have been way fewer numbers of intakes and certainly bookings happening all over the country. But what we're finding is that there's still a disproportionate number of LGBT youth who have continued to be system involved. And we can think of a number of reasons why that is. Again, conflict at home, homelessness, right? All of these things got exaggerated because of the pandemic. And so our next wave of analysis will be really interesting just to compare and to see what the patterns and the waves of this has been. So looking at, excuse me, sustained charges. So we found that Black and Latinx youth who are feminine presenting, meaning girls who are, gender conforming, gender non-conforming boys, so boys who present in a more feminine way, and trans girls are more likely to receive arrests for status offenses, right? And a status offense is an offense that you can get only as a minor, and nonviolent misdemeanors that are not sustained in court. And gender nonconforming Black boys, and so feminine presenting Black boys and transgender Black girls are 230% more likely to be in this group. We found that Black and Latinx youth who are masculine presenting, so boys who are gender conforming, gender non-conforming girls, right? So girls who present in a more masculine way, and transgender boys are more likely to receive violent and weapons charges. Gender non-conforming Black girls and transgender Black boys are 290% more likely to be in this group. Looking at high risk scores, we found that Black girls are 160% more likely to receive a high risk score. Black boys are 70% more likely. And LGBTQ GNCT youth overall are 50% more likely. So I find this really interesting looking at, I would have made assumptions that Black boys were had a higher chance of receiving a high risk score. But if we go back to what's happening with girls at school, right? And we go back to what's happening with the number of girls in 40% of girls who identify as LGBT in our juvenile detention facilities, it makes sense, right? That girls are more likely to receive, Black girls in particular are more likely to receive a high risk score. And I'd be really curious, continuing to do some research to disentangle why that is. Excuse us. So what are the implications for this, right? Like now that we have this data, what are opportunities for us to use the data to make some really relevant reforms? And so given these findings, we could consider revalidating our risk needs and assessments to consider the intersections of race, ethnicity, and SOGI. To my understanding right now, risk assessments don't ask about young people's sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So there are opportunities with the sites we're working right now to think about revalidating their risk assessment tools. Divert more youth with status offenses and nonviolent misdemeanors, right? So the young people who are feminine presenting across gender identity, and certainly those of color, are getting picked up for diverting or for status offenses and nonviolent misdemeanors that aren't even held up in court. So young people are being subjected to the trauma of being arrested and then getting to court and and not having their charges sustained. So it's great that what's happening once they get to court, they're not being sort of funneled deeper into the system. But if we could avoid the experience of arrest altogether, I think that would minimize the trauma on this population. And a lot of places are moving to decriminalize misdemeanors anyways. And so even taking it a step further from diversion would be an opportunity to decriminalize both status offenses and misdemeanors. And then developing community programs for youth with violence and weapon charges that did not involve serious injury. So while masculine presenting Black and brown youth were getting picked up for weapons charges at a much higher rate, those were not actually, the weapons actually weren't used in the offense that they were picked up for. So is there an opportunity for youth who are not using the weapons to go through a weapons diversion program that again keeps them out of the system, from getting deeper in the system, and also starts to address what's happening outside of this snapshot in time that is creating an environment where they feel the need to carry a weapon. So while these programs aren't explicitly for LGBT youth, given the data, they would absolutely target LGBT youth. And I think this is really important, again, because a lot of LGBT youth in the system aren't out and don't necessarily want to go to LGBT programs, right? So if we can think about programs based on the data that identify the circumstances for which they're getting arrested, then we can actually better support LGBT youth without forcing them to come out, and really addressing their life circumstances. So that's what I have. I know we don't have a ton of time. I'm happy to take questions now, or if y'all want to email me questions. Lily, I'll follow your lead.
Yeah, so we have a couple of minutes, or we have exactly a few minutes before we go into our next part of the day. But there are a couple of questions that are coming into the chat that I just wanted to highlight. Angela Weeks asks, is there an frequently asked question around data collection that you use to help educate staff? Like an FAQ, do you have like a I guess like a handout? That's the way that I'm interpreting this.
We have a practice guide,
okay,
that I think is fairly easy. I say it's easy to read because I wrote it, but we do have a practice guide that I would be happy to share. We also have a write-up on this initiative that provides a little bit of information. So I'm happy I don't know if you want to collect emails for folks who are interested in some resources, then I can send out what we have as a resource.
great. And then Jennifer asks, are King and Pierce County confirmed? Can we support that coming work early?
Nicholas, can I say? So we are all pretty close to being confirmed. We are applying for some funding. And so once that is approved, I would say we're confirmed.
And then last question, are there examples of better risk/needs assessments? We'd love to consider those for healthcare considerations as well.
If I can get your email, yes, let's talk about that over email.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Aisha, for coming and speaking with us. We really appreciate your presentation. Oh, hi. And your presentation partner did an excellent job as well. I just want to say that. So folks, if you could just join me in giving as much virtual gratitude as you can for this incredible research. I think, you know, one of the things that we're trying to do with equality is really improve those data collections as well. And I think that series policy is really, really leading the way in that way. And Aisha, your work around this is just a true example of leadership for these young people. And so much gratitude to what you all are doing. I'm really excited to continue to partner and see how this is going to impact Washington State. Yay!
Yeah, we are really, really excited. She's excited. And thanks everyone for being, I'm just getting to the comments now. Thank you for the very, very sweet comments about doing the mom boss thing. It's rough. So thanks for the support. And for those of you that clarified some of the terminology, I would have loved to spend more time with it because I think it's important, but it looks like a lot of y'all handled that in the chat. So thank you so much, everybody.
Great. Okay, thank you everyone. We are just now approaching our final hour of our convening. I'm going to go ahead and reshare my screen because we are going to hear from our lived experts. Please please join me in welcoming Minnie, Jesus, and Espen. Unfortunately, Dre was not able to make it here today. So if Minnie, Jesus, and Espen, if you all can go ahead and turn on your video, we can go ahead and get started with our lived experience panel. Hi, Minnie. Hi, Jesus, welcome. Is Espen here as well? Okay, she might be running a little bit behind. All right, so in that way, we are gonna go ahead and get started with some of our questions for you all. Welcome, welcome. And I am bringing them up right now. So the first question that we have is more of an introduction. And mainly we just want to hear, your name, what are your pronouns, your background, a little bit about, why you're passionate about being here today. And then we also want to know who is your queer icon, and why. And then, and so that's what we're going to do in terms of starting for these questions today. So, Minnie or Jesus, I don't know which one of you wants to start off, but you all can go ahead and get started.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, technically, right? It's 11:04, so good morning. I'm Minnie Bliesner. I go by she, they pronouns, and I am an Indigenous Coast Salish Lummi woman. I'm also a mother, an influencer, a creator of many things, and I'm pretty involved in the LGBTQ plus community. I identify as pansexual, and I practically grew up in foster care from 7 years old until I aged out at 19 years old. So I'd say my queer icon is definitely Lady Gaga. I just love Lady Gaga, everything about her. From her talent to her music to literally everything. So, and her dogs. So I think is that all you asked, Lily? I think that's it.
I kept myself on mute for purposes, but yes, that's exactly what I was asking.
Okay.
Thank you, Minnie. We're so happy to have you here today. Jesus, you want to go ahead and intro yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I use they, them pronouns. I am a 20-year-old college student and currently at Bellevue College. I have been doing work with student organizing since my sophomore year of high school, so since I was like 16. Most of it has been around domestic violence work and gender-based violence. As a survivor, I sort of created a team of other survivors at my high school that wanted to see better support systems for the youth in our building that were also survivors or that were currently experiencing unhealthy relationships. And a lot of that had overlap with the queer community. And as a queer person myself, that's the kind of work I've been doing. I've also done quite some work in immigration justice as an undocumented person. I bring that perspective to the table, formally undocumented, I suppose. But yeah, one more question, right? I have queer icon. This one took me a while. Personally, there is a writer from Mexico from many years ago. Her name was Sor Juana Inés. She was a queer nun who wrote a lot of like early feminist literature in Mexico at a time where it was like very, very much ahead of its time. So yeah, just everything about her is so cool.
Absolutely love it. And thank you all so much for highlighting the folks who inspire you, but also really highlighting yourselves. We are really, really grateful that you all are here today to kind of speak to your expertise. Yeah, wonderful. Yes, let's drop some names in the chat. Let's do it. We want to invite folks as we're having this conversation today to ask questions. Please be conscientious of the questions you ask, right? Like folks from lived experience, we want to honor their expertise, but we also don't want to make the space difficult, right? So we do invite folks from the audience to ask questions, but please be conscientious of the questions that you ask. That being said, though, we're going to kind of get a little bit deep in this next question. And I think, I think that there's been a lot of conversation about like the progress that we've made and the fact that like there's a lot of like young people, like things have really changed for young people comparatively to like years and years ago. But I'm curious, like from your all's perspective, like what is the biggest challenge that you believe LGBTQ youth like face today?
Yeah, I could speak to that a little bit from my perspective. Um, I feel that, I mean, we're all aware of the social norms that keep queer people in boxes and keep them separate from living their lives freely and happily. Um, but to sort of just be mindful of the fact that um, like we celebrate coming out, and this is a message that I've been seeing over and over again this Pride Month, is that we celebrate coming out instead of like allies, cisgender people and straight people, um, acknowledging that that you've like very willingly made um, queer people's lives extremely difficult, and you've made it very hard to even begin to understand ourselves. Personally, I identify as queer, but as a 20-year-old, I'm still figuring out so much about myself, and there's a lot about myself that I'm not sure is genuine, because I spent so much of my childhood picking parts out of me that I thought wouldn't keep me safe, and that made all the sense. But now that I'm in a safer place, I just don't feel like I know myself very well. And that is really difficult.
I totally agree with that. I actually remember having this conversation with Lily when we were talking about being in survivor mode. There's definitely a few years in my life that I miss that development piece, where I miss like learning about myself and experiencing and just like trying to navigate like who I was and what I was trying to shut out just to be safe, like you said. And it wasn't until I feel like I didn't really truly come out until after high school, where I was like, well, dang, now I'm safe to do so why not? And that still was like a lot of developing and just realizing and learning. And I totally agree. And even now I'd say I'm still just trying to learn and grow. And but it's hard to say, because like Lily said, a lot of things have changed since I was a queer youth. So I think I don't know if I can exactly speak to that correctly.
Yeah, I appreciate you all really bringing up the nuance with this, right? Like, I think that sometimes us as allies and sometimes us as providers, we want like the solution. We want to know like, how can we help you? How can we do this? But sometimes it's really difficult because we don't take the time to sit in the nuance of like us figuring out ourselves, right? Like it can be really difficult for us going through these systems and having to deal with like the day to day, and then to just like have someone who's like so willing is like, yeah, that's really great. And also like, I have no idea what I actually need. Like I need to be me, right? Um, and Jesus, I really appreciate you bringing up this idea of like, wait, like the celebration happened, but can we acknowledge the pain that has been caused, right? Like people are so quick to celebrate Pride, but like, are we actually like acknowledging and holding like communities accountable for the pain and the history that we've had to carry, right? So a lot of love for those comments that you all are presenting here. Yeah, so that being said, I think one of the things that especially when we talk about LGBTQ issues, is that a lot of people, I think, really look at these LGBTQ issues in a monolith, right? And we know that for ourselves as people, that there are so many other things that like impact us in addition to our LGBTQ identity. So my next question is like, you know, how have your other identities like impacted you as an LGBTQ person?
Minnie, I can go first if you like, unless you had something you wanted to share off the bat. Okay. Like I mentioned earlier, I would consider myself to be previously undocumented, and that combination with being queer has made a really large part of my young adult life and life as a minor really difficult, because immediately services are very different. At the age of like 12 or 13, when I first had received services and was looking to find help for like my housing and living situation, it was just more traumatizing than things already were, you know, because I think sometimes maybe the tools just aren't there. And oftentimes it just, I mean, how do you explain away institutional exclusion? But that definitely has an impact on how like the kind of space that you have to understand yourself as a person and to actually find some sort of fulfillment. At least it has been for me, because not knowing where I'm safe and where I can find help, and where I don't have to walk on eggshells to find support, very often leaves me not looking for support at all, or feeling like it's not an option. So yeah, that's how my experience as a person who as an immigrant to the United States has impacted my experience as a queer person. So for some context, I probably should have added, I came here at the very ripe age of 6 months after being born. I have only known the United States, never been anywhere else. But I was still undocumented for a very long time, simply because that's how it is. So yeah, now I have a sort of different status. It's not protected, but it is, I'm able to work and I am not on the priority list for like deportation. So it like definitely takes off the stress of that, and it gives you more space to sort of deal with this other part of your life, which generally I feel very supported. I live in a very queer friendly community, and even then I have a lot of internal work to do. So yeah, if any of that was like unclear, feel free to send a question.
No, that was like, I think that that's like so important. Like just you talking about like the very idea of like you having to navigate services based on your like status, like that is something that like a lot of us don't have to deal with, right? And I just want to acknowledge like the unique circumstances that you had to go through and how that can be like so convoluted with like your queer identity, but also just like dang, like you're doing it, you're getting through it, and you're like queer, you're here, you're proud, right? Like this is good, this is good stuff. You don't have to clarify anything, you did an amazing job. Minnie, do you want to go ahead and answer that question as well?
Yeah, so I was just kind of thinking, there was a point where, I mean, when you do have like all these different intersectional layers that cause more barriers, and then I think I was at a point where like I didn't want to come out because I knew that would just cause another barrier for me. And then once I did reach that point of like coming out and being open, it was like that was like the only identity I had to other folks when they looked at me. Like I don't know, I felt like that was kind of stripping away from everything else that I am. And so it was kind of funny how that kind of just like went back and forth. And like even now, so I have a pride flag outside of my house, and sometimes it gets taken down. Since I've lived here, I've been here for 4 months, and it's gotten taken down twice. I want to put it up again, but another part of me is like, well, I'm too stressed out. I don't want to worry about the stress. I don't want to do like it. I like it, but then if like, I don't know, I kind of go back and forth between that. And then I'm like, or what if I get hate crimed or something? And I'm like walking to my car, I don't know. And all these things are running through my head, but then I'm like, no, fuck it. Like, I'm going to put it back up and it's going to be there and it's going to keep coming back up. But I do struggle with that back and forth. And then it's like, well, am I catering more to that one identity that I am? And am I like, it's all just like this weird balance in my head that probably other folks don't even care about, like, or don't even see what I see, because it's all just like self-reflective. So it's really just me putting that stress on myself for no reason. But I think that is like a constant battle of like, okay, what am I going to have to battle with today? Like whether that's internally or externally.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that a lot. And thank you for speaking your truth, Minnie. I also just want to acknowledge, I think Espen has joined us. Espen, if you want to go ahead and turn on your camera and come join this conversation with us, that would be really lovely. We're going to go ahead and ask you to introduce yourself. So your name, your pronouns, like what brings you here today, and then who is your queer icon, Espen, if you can hear me. Espen. She was here a minute ago. I know she was. Okay. Well, while we're figuring out technical difficulties with Espen, I guess one question that we are having from our audience member, this is from Samantha, and is, what is something you wish professionals practice more when it comes to supporting LGBTQ plus gender nonconforming youth, young people? Or what is something you see professionals doing with good intentions, but is not always best supportive for this community? And so, Minnie, I don't know if you want to speak on that, and then Jesus, if you want to speak on
that. I'm mostly thinking about the second question. I feel like I get to this a lot, but there is a point where you can, you personally like get so curious, and that's like, that can be, I think that can be harmful, even more harmful for the youth when you are constantly pushing. And there is a point where like some folks they try to be so helpful that it's really not helpful. It actually has a negative impact. And it's sometimes, you know, you're just not ready. Sometimes you're not ready, or you're not comfortable with it yourself yet. And you're not there. So I think when you're always being pried at or pushed at, or like pushed to do these things or talk about these things, you're just not ready, and that can be more harmful. I've seen that a lot. So I think you really have to like have a little self-reflection moment of, am I just trying to appease my own curiosity, or am I really trying to help this LGBTQ plus identifying person or youth or whatever that may be? And then answer it yourself. And if it's going to help and support the youth, and if not, then you might just need to let it go. And then the first one, and I don't know if Jesus has any more to add. Sorry.
Oh, no, continue by all means. Oh, you muted.
I muted. I was always at a point when I was a youth, I was too shy and too reserved to ever do anything and like go out and do anything myself. So I felt like my social worker was always giving me like a pamphlet of like these different groups or different LGBTQ plus like youth-led communities I could join. But I was never the one to like send the email or call or like show up or like bring myself there. So I think that would have really helped me to have someone take that initiative for me instead of just like hand these papers over to me and to expect me to do anything, because I wasn't going to. That's just how I was when I was young. I mean, I would have really liked someone to like take it a little bit of a step further, as well as constantly seeking knowledge. We always say this, our youth are 2 steps ahead of us. So when you're learning something, it probably is something new that came out like a year or 2 ago. So constantly seek that knowledge and keep trying to learn and have those conversations.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of what you just said, Mimi. Yeah, and I mean, what I would add to that for something I see professionals do very frequently is, I don't know, and sometimes it comes back to that question of how other identities sort of overlap with each other, and like that intersectional piece, how it changes how you're perceived. Personally, a lot of service providers that I've worked with have a tendency to, there's a term for it. They essentially show me their values in a way that is just to show that they have certain values, and create sort of like a barrier between us where when like a youth meets with a new provider, yeah, performative, virtue signaling, right? Like that's what that term is. Basically, like I will have a lot of adults come to me only to complain about all the things that I struggle through and that other queer people struggle through and that other brown people struggle through. And it's just to be like, oh yeah, like I totally get it. And if you're a service provider and you're not queer or a person of color, I think one of the best things you can do is really just put your hands up and say, I don't understand. That's better than telling me that you do understand and feeling like, well, I know you don't. So clearly this conversation isn't going to go that well because you're not going to understand the fact that you don't even understand. So you don't know what questions to ask. You don't know that you do have to ask questions, that this is an ongoing process where you continue to learn, because I have to learn. I'm still learning about myself and other people within my community. And I feel like virtue signaling is often also a sign of, like I said, sort of people stagnating their growth by thinking that we've done enough, we've learned enough, that's it, you know? And that is super, super harmful. And I've seen it just time and again. Another small thing that kind of goes with that is particularly with queer youth that don't use the pronouns that you expect them to use, like just kind of basic etiquette and decency is often to like not make it about yourself and apologize like incessantly, because it's really uncomfortable to have to like have that burden put onto you to be like, no, it's okay, it's fine. Like if it really is that bad for you, like deal with it with yourself. I don't want to hear it from multiple people throughout the day, you know, that they've messed up my pronouns, because it's a reminder to me, and then it's also a burden on me to make them feel okay for doing that. So yeah, I guess when it comes to supporting the youth in your life, I feel like understanding the boundaries and understanding the fact that it's totally valid to complain, but very often if you're complaining to the people who are going through it, it doesn't help anyone. It feels performative and it feels like really tone deaf to, like, I know that queer people suffer. Like, yeah, cool, I figured. So I think as a service provider, it's better to just sort of like accept it as the truth and I don't know, like every person is different. Find out what that person needs specifically, rather than throwing a blanket of just guilt over them and expecting that to do something to help them.
And Jesus, I really appreciate the word that you use, guilt, because I think a lot of providers, a lot of providers do come from lived experience, but there are a lot of providers who don't, right? And even folks with lived experience, there's a real vast, different, identity within each of those experiences, right? We all don't live the same, the same life, right? But I do think guilt is a really great way to classify that, and the importance of getting over that to actually get to your needs and to our needs as young people in this system is just so important. So thank you so much for speaking that truth. And Jen even says in the chat here, this is tough but important to hear. Thank you for this transparency. And I think that this is such a unique opportunity, right, to say that, because when you're in the moment receiving these services, you can't, you don't, I mean, there are some people who are really assertive, but there are also some people who it's just the go-to is just why would I call you out on this? You hold so much power right now. Why would I say that I need you to not center yourself when I need something from you? So definitely understand these dynamics and how tough it is, and really appreciate the truth that both of you are speaking right now. Espen, I'm gonna just try one more time. Are you there? Technical difficulties, how are we doing? Are you able to come off of mute? Are you able to come off of the video or come onto video and join us today? Okay, I'm not hearing a response. So we will go ahead and push forward. So I think that we covered the how can a service provider help you, but I think a lot about this idea of what is one question that you all wished when you were receiving services someone would have asked you? What is one thing you wish that they could have asked you when you were younger? And I don't know if Jesus, you want to start this one since Minnie started the last one.
Oh yeah, although I wanted to point out that Espen just sent a message on the chat.
Espen, are you joining our lived experience panel?
Yeah, I am.
Hi, welcome. It's great to hear from you. Feel free to come onto camera if you want to. But I think what we're going to do is we're going to back up a little bit so that you have a little bit of space to introduce yourself. So you can go ahead and tell us your name, your pronouns, kind of what brings you here today, and a little bit of who is your queer icon?
Okay. I'm gonna have to think about that last question, but I can definitely knock out the first couple of questions. So my name is Espen James. My pronouns are she, her. I would say the thing that brought me to this panel is just to educate people on my side and my experience of the system, being a trans femme, Indigenous affiliated person. And then I would say for a queer icon, right now I really love Dominique Jackson. She plays Elektra in Pose. And I love the energy.
Thank you, Espen, for joining us, and thank you for talking about your queer icon and who you really look up to. So I also want to ask you, Espen, a couple of questions that we've already covered with Minnie and Jesus, since you weren't here earlier, and I just want to ask you, what do you think is the biggest challenge that LGBTQ youth face today?
I mean, if we're gonna get into that topic, I think the first thing we really have to talk about is, you know, we've made some impacts and we've had a little bit of improvement on LGBTQ plus youth suicide rates, but that is still something that a lot of our young people still have issues with today. I think that young people still don't feel heard, they still don't feel supported. And I mean, I can definitely identify with those youth, but I think that that would be a really big issue. And I also think that, I don't know, I think at the end of the day, another issue that youth still face is, I don't know, I think some people don't find youth credible just because of their age. And I think that that is complete, it's just completely insane, because I think that no matter somebody's age, everyone has a story to tell and everyone can have insight and wisdom. Um, but I think it's essential when we're looking at certain things and we're looking at certain parts of the system to use youth to get their perspective versus an adult's.
Thank you for that insight. I think that that's so true. Like this idea of like paternalism is like really present, and like, but also at the same time, it's like your life going through that system. So like, where is that balance of like you helping me versus you telling me what to do versus me having autonomy over the circumstances that I'm experiencing? Really, really appreciate that nuance that you're bringing. And then the other question that we kind of talked about that I wanted to also give you an opportunity to speak on is, how have your other identities impacted you as an LGBTQ plus person?
Well, being somebody who is trans femme and indigenous, I am more, how would I say, white presenting. So I mean, I kind of run into a lot of issues with that when I do present, or I would say, I'm very, very adamant about my tribal affiliations and how very in tune I am with that. But I mean, a lot of people who are ignorant and don't want to ask me questions or get to know me would just perceive me as a white person. And while that still is a part of me, you know, I can admit that. Um, Predominantly, I am Alaska Native, so it's not like I get much of a choice of what my skin color is. But I feel like that is an issue I run into a lot as a part of another issue with my identity. Um, but if it comes down to it, something outside of that, I mean, being a trans femme person, and being somebody who is a very, very young person, um, and experiencing the things I'm experiencing, it's not like my ideal image of myself is the most best. It's not like people are the most respectful. It's not like these state employees actually understand what I'm going through, nor do they give me grace with the issues that I still face each and every single day of my life, whether or not it's from myself or from other people. Um, so yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking that truth as well. And you're really bringing up really important nuances and this idea of like, how are we actually serving like the whole young person, right? Versus what we assume about a young person. I also wanted to ask, this was a question that came from an audience member, but you know, what is something you wish professional practice more when it comes to supporting LGBTQ plus gender nonconforming young people? Or what is something you see professionals doing with good intentions that is not always best / supportive for this community?
Well, let's keep it real. First things first, I think that a lot of these state employees that I work with personally in the foster care side, especially with LGBTQ plus youth, because I think that a lot of our LGBTQIA affiliated youth, we have been through a lot already at such a young age. And I think that a lot of these staff don't understand that. I think that they lack to realize that at the end of the day, one, we are still youth. Two, our opinions are valid. Three, we have been through so much. And on top of that, we're just traumatized. We're very hurt 9 times out of 10. And yes, you know, a lot of us are resilient. We're all still affected each and every single day. I think that a lot of these adults that I work with run into this internal struggle with listening to me because I am a minor. And then I think another thing that they run into is just like, at the end of the day, a lot of these staff are very like immature and childish. Like they want to run and continue an argument on, even if the other person on the side of the argument is trying to stop it and trying to let it go and trying to de-escalate, you know, because I mean, I don't know about everyone else. Personally, I don't like arguing. I like being very, very relaxed. Sometimes I can argue. I think that, you know, it's just not the most effective thing 9 times out of 10, but I think that a lot of these staff continuously like just making things worse. Whether or not it's arguing with these youth, or it's escalating them, or it's labeling them, or it's not understanding their issues and just, you know, blaming everything on them versus seeking to provide them with support. You know, these staff just aren't educated and they're just not well experienced. They're not equipped to handle, you know, I mean, they're not equipped to handle regular youth, let alone LGBTQ plus youth. I think that's a real big issue that I see from it on a day-to-day basis.
And I appreciate you bringing that point up. I think that there's a lot of like folks who are really well-meaning in the system, but also like because of all of the nuances that you're bringing up, sometimes youth don't perform to like the system's timeline. And that just creates like a lot of like misunderstanding about who these young people are and like how they show up in the system and then like their experience in the system. And so really appreciate some of the nuance things that you're bringing here right now. And Katie says, thank you for sharing your experience, Espen. Amber says, real talk, hard to hear and needs to be heard. Thank you. So this question is then for everyone. So we're going to take it a little bit in like a learning opportunity direction, right? So what is one thing a provider had done / for with you that had positive impact? If nothing comes to mind, what would you hope or imagine? And Minnie, I don't know if you want to start us this time around.
I'll start since you called me out. I honestly, the biggest thing was introducing me to a group of other folks who also had experience or were systems involved. That was the biggest impact on me, honestly, as a youth with all these intersectional identities. I think it's easy to feel alone. So when I finally did get to a point of like meeting other youth that were like in very similar positions as it was kind of like, holy crap, I'm not alone. And like, these people are pretty cool. And like, I didn't have to hide different things about myself just for the comfort of being myself. So I think that was one of the best things, honestly. I met so many people and I've had relationships and friendships with them for like the past 10 years now. So that was something I am located in Spokane. So that was something I wasn't really seeing in Spokane and, or even in my high school. So it was really nice, like having those similarities to youth my age.
Yeah, something so like I said, my experience with services isn't the best. I don't have the best history with it. I found that it can be kind of inconsistent. However, One person who really, really supported me and actually was one of the people who brought the panel to my attention, really supported me. And Minnie, I remember you were talking earlier about how sometimes you sort of just get that message of like, here's all the different places you can go to, but like figure your way there. And you know, it's like, well, okay, not gonna happen. But this person was very active and very like engaged in my life. And it changes the trajectory of your life as a young person, as a minor, because there's so much that if you don't want to go through with the process of reporting all of the awful shit that happens to you as a youth, like adults in the school building that you go to, or most of the adults around you, aren't people that you can tell, because immediately they're mandated to make a report, and that doesn't always work in your favor. So having a more, not necessarily flexible, but understanding of who will benefit from that report being made, or you know, understanding the real boundary of when the report needs to be made. Sometimes youth are in situations that are not the best, but reporting only makes them worse. It's not going to improve. Or you know, the youth isn't in a place to leave certain situations, and it feels very empowering to have the agency to say, I want to tell you about this and I want to receive help for it, but I don't want you to like remove me from my home. I can't do that, you know? So personally, those experiences with adults who have supported me in my like young adult life are those who put their I guess tried to push power imbalances aside, the fact that they're like a gatekeeper for what my life can look like, and just meeting me as a person and having that compassion with me, and sort of having teaching me to have that same compassion with myself, has really, really changes things. And nowadays, that's what I reflect on the most, are those moments. And how they really, really made a difference. Because if I hadn't received those people in my life who gave me help that no other service providers were giving me, I couldn't tell you where I'd be right now. I could tell you that my life would have been a lot more difficult, and that it would have been a lot shittier, because sometimes you can help youth without controlling their lives. And I think that that's a kind of common theme, is feeling like you can't receive help unless you change your life in such a way that someone else thinks is best for you. But we don't expect it of anyone else. So yeah.
And then to also just like add on to that, like, you know, we then have to grow up and become adults, right? Like y'all get to like exit after a certain age, but we have to like deal with the repercussions of like the things in which like we didn't have control over. Right. So like the earlier that we can, I think, give that autonomy, I think the better it prepares us to really deal with like the rest of the stuff we have to deal with. And like to Espen's point, like there's trauma associated with that too, but also like knowing that you have the power to be able to like make the decisions about your circumstance, I think really helps be protective as you go through navigating how to get over that trauma, right? So really, really wonderful points you both are making here. And Espen, I don't know if this is a question that you also want to answer, but it is, what is one thing a provider had done for with you that had a positive impact? And if you can't think of one, what is something that you wish a provider would have done?
You know, at the end of the day, I think that I probably won't be able to, list out an ideal vision, or list out an experience like these other two people have done. But I do think that's something that I'd love and I think would be so much more effective to see more of in the system would be having youth be the forefront of their case management. I do think that it's something that's very essential because at the end of the day, when we're talking about case management, we're talking about why this case became a thing, you have to think about literally who is the only person that is the center of attention, so to say. In this case, it is this youth, it is this dependent person, it is this person that was brought into the system for some sort of reason. And at the end of the day, I think that no matter what age, they still have some autonomy to speak up and vocalize what they want, whether or not they're 5 or they're 17. It doesn't change. They still have something that they would love to see more of, whether or not it's an ideal home, or an ideal vision for a foster parent, or more things that they'd love to do to build a relationship with a foster parent, or whether or not it's things that they could do to strengthen their relationship with their parents or relatives or just anything. I think that at the end of the day, social workers get to be the forefront of what is in the child's best interest. And I think that, at the end of the day, some people have this false delusion that the system actually takes care of its kids, and that's just not the truth. These policies that the Department of Children, Youth, and Families has built up aren't there to protect children as much as people would believe. I think that they're there to cover liability and to make things more easy for social workers. And while yes, DCYF is understaffed, it does not mean that the re-traumatization that the department puts children through is acceptable and it's okay. It doesn't change just because you have lack of resources and you guys have, less people and less bodies that can make these decisions and have these certifications under their belt. It doesn't change. It doesn't remove that aspect of, you guys are a system that is traumatizing children. It doesn't get removed.
Minnie, you said that you also wanted to add some additional comments.
After Jesus spoke, they brought up some really good points that triggered a thought that I had. Something that would have really helped me was that I realized that around the age of 10, when I started having crushes on boys, I was also having crushes on girls. And so I came out at a pretty young age. And at that time, I didn't really know it was very different. So I just, I felt safe and okay with my social worker. And I told her, and she reported it, and it was in my case file for the rest of my life. And that sucked. That really sucked, because that was a huge decision maker for a lot of my placements. I've tried counting, and I've had somewhere between 13 to 16 placements, whether that was a family relative who thought they could do it, or a group home, or a foster parent. And I wasn't even ready to really make it public with myself, because as I got older, I realized how different I was and how that really affected my life. So every single time I went to a new placement, I had to come out over and over and over again and have these awkward conversations that I wasn't comfortable and ready with. And so it kind of plays on what Jesus was talking about with, we understand that you have these policies and different reports that you have to make, but at the same time, just think about it, give a little grace. We're not asking you to break your policies by any means, but that case file really followed me forever, and it sucked. It really did suck. And I think that was another thing that really halted a lot of my identities and trying to figure myself out because of that, because I was scared. When someone hears something about yourself, they assume that I don't know what it was, but everyone just assumed I was going to be some rebellious child that would that I wasn't allowed to have slumber parties with other girls anymore, and I wasn't allowed to have girlfriends over to study or like anything. There was no normalcy involved with that, and I truly, because that is where it started, was with my case file from when I first entered care. So I think that's kind of similar to what Jesus was saying, and they we understand, like I said, there's policies, but just think about it. Give a little grace in some areas when you can. It's hard. It's already hard on us.
Thank you, Minnie, for sharing. And Espen says, if time allows, I have something to add. And absolutely, actually, we have about a minute left. And so I just want, if there's any last things that you all want to say, just go round robin one more time before we depart for the day. So Espen, go ahead and give us your comments.
Well, first off, to the other people that are speaking on this, your guys' stories are very, very important. I love hearing each and every single part of it. I appreciate it. And then kind of just to, I would say, back off of Minnie's story, I think that, putting this little fact that you at one point stated that you were interested in girls and it became such a relevant thing in your case, it is so true that becomes something. One thing that you do or you say can affect what happens from you going forward on your case notes. And I mean, whether or not it's effective is still unknown. I mean, I've been in foster care for over a year, and I have had 2 placements offered to me. 2. And I mean, the department can blame it on COVID, they can blame it on me being trans, and they can blame it on me and my age, and they can just do so many things. It does not excuse the fact that I have been here for over a year with no stability and no normalcy. It doesn't explain why, after all of this time, every single time that I get emotionally fueled, that it's not, it's never, oh, well, this is understandable because there is no physical stability and the emotional instability is directly linked with that. It's always, this is a conscious decision they're making, and they're in the right mind to make this decision at all times, and there's no other factors at play. So hearing the rest of y'all's stories is very invigorating, and I love hearing it. Just keep speaking your truth, and you guys are amazing for doing this.
Thank you, Espen. That's really kind of you. And I wanted to add just that last note too, that for me, I think I've brought up a lot how my experience with systems is pretty different. Generally speaking, I didn't receive too much support throughout my youth because, again, I was either too afraid or I did and things didn't go well. And very often it was moments like those that I described where my agency felt like it was being stripped away, that I felt, okay, this is it. This is where I stop receiving help, because this isn't help. This is going back to the same sort of problem that I'm dealing with, because at home it's the lack of agency that I'm struggling with, and I come here for help, and now it's the same thing, just like a different circumstance. So I think what would have been better, what would have been just so good as a much younger person was, I don't know, to receive help without having to make these really enormous critical decisions about whether or not I would live with my parents. Like that. I kind of just wish I could have been supported and nurtured, because I was clearly struggling for such a long time with things like attendance, with my housing situation. There were very many clear signs along the way. And it wasn't until I was 16 and I asked for help at actually like a local organization in Seattle, Rest, if you've heard of it. And that's what like changed my life, was being a minor that could receive help without immediately changing the conversation into the people around me. It was like, how do I keep you safe right now? That's the priority. I don't care about taking you out of where you are. I don't, you know, yeah, I guess if you have the grace to do that, if you have the ability to advocate for that, that's what I would value the most, is I think because that's what I needed, was just help, no questions asked. And I know that that's not always possible, but I'm an example of people who fall through the cracks and who don't ever receive that support. And now I'm 20 and I really wish I had received more help. Yeah.
Minnie, do you have any last minute comments that you want to say? Okay. Well, we are about at that time. There's a tremendous amount of gratitude pouring in from the chat. I encourage you all to read that. Please, everyone who is here, join me in expressing the just immense amount of gratitude that we have for our three panelists, and really just wanting you all to know and recognize that you really are informing and changing the way that we really think and deliver in these systems, and to never stop beating that drum, right? Never stop beating that drum, because you all are so powerful, and we are so appreciative that you spent your time here today to talk with us. So virtual Zoom claps, I know that that's a little bit awkward with where we are, to end on that note, but so with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Nicholas to send us out for the day.
Thank you, Lily. And I couldn't agree with you more, Lily. Thank you so much to our panel. That was tremendously powerful. I do want to respect your time, and we are out of time. So we're going to skip this closing activity, but I would encourage you to really think about, especially here, if you've done the training with me, you've seen this many times and done it many times, to think about your now what, and really apply the lessons from today and turn it into an action item. And so again, just really encourage you to turn that into an action item. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for being with us today. Feel free to follow up with us, and we will hopefully see you in person next year. Take care.
I'm going to remain on the line for like 10 more minutes. So if you have lingering questions, comments, concerns, you're welcome to do that.
Lily, will you do the next slide so they can easily access our emails?
Absolutely. You know, contact information is important.
Thank you.